8 years ago, I quit drinking, and I completely ruined my life. Eight years ago, I thought I was on the verge of breaking through. And I was also living a lie. And what came shortly after that was the beginning of a deconstruction of my entire life. The lens that I chose to experience life through was through the out of doors.
Jake!
Most likely the biggest challenge that I faced in regards to choosing the outdoors as a medium in regards to interacting with the world and finding my way. The biggest challenge was the social structure around my family. My family was very conventional. They were also a generation, my brothers and sisters were at least a generation removed from me, and my parents were much older. And so the idea of making a living in the out of doors seemed completely preposterous. It didn't seem as though it was a viable way of being. It showed me that that there was a possibility that I could make my way. And so those initial successes drove me on into the professional continuum. And then the demon that chased me was this whole idea. It was driven by my father, and I'm not blaming him because he was concerned about my welfare. But ultimately, he never thought it was a viable way to be. So I was constantly trying to do something better. I was constantly trying to show him that I could be successful. And then once I became successful at it, I didn't recognize it, and I continued to keep seeking out something else in order to show my value, to show my worth. And I kept trying to show it to the outside world because inside it never felt like I belonged. It never felt as if I was good enough. And so with success came the desire to be more successful. I think the most important thing is we need a completely different definition of what addiction is, simply because we think about addiction as a dependency on a substance, and that is actually a sign or symptom of an underlying cause. And so what addiction really is, for me, addiction was trying to mask this feeling of undeserving, this feeling of not being good enough, and then I masked that in several different ways, which was one, through accomplishment in the out of doors, climbing, skiing, mountaineering, etc., and just chalking up the, one thing after another. And so nothing was ever good enough. And so that was a very strong addiction for me. And then, physically you can only do so much. And so when I would become tired and when I needed rest, well, I started seeking out substance in order to mask the feeling of undeserving, to mask the feeling of not being good enough. In short, addiction is the avoidance of the feelings that we have inside, the avoidance of not feeling connected and not feeling as if we belong to a community. That's what I really believe addiction is. This want to be connected, but the inability to actually feel it and to recognize what it is that we're part of. caused me to quit drinking was, you know, it was classic in my, like when I look at it in retrospect, the reasons why I did it were competitive. And so a friend of mine needed to stop drinking. It was clear that he had a serious problem. And I wanted to support him. And also at the same time, I had a little bit of ego involved in it. And I basically wanted to prove to him how easy it was. And so he needed to do it, and I wanted to support him as a friend. And so I told him if he would go a year, I would go with him. And then what I found out during that process, because when I initially quit, I was expecting on day 365 to begin again. And then 3 to 6 months into the process, I began to realize that I was using alcohol as a crutch in order to not feel some specific things. Emotionally, I started to break down. And ironically, you know, I quit drinking, you know, almost 8 years ago. And then it took an entire year of not drinking to realize that I actually needed to stop using some other substances. And so the friend that I quit drinking for turned around and said, we should probably quit doing cocaine. Because while I was not drinking, I was definitely using a lot of substance in order to placate the feelings that were coming up. With that being said, stopping drinking was a stepping stone in order to get me to the point to recognize that I had these deep-seated feelings that I'd never really looked at, I'd never addressed. Initially, the benefits that I found were, there was many things. Like one, my sleeping, I started to sleep better. I had more energy, I had more time, I had more money. I was more focused, specifically, especially once I got the cocaine off of board. I ultimately had the capacity to realize that I wanted something different in my life, and I started to go for that. And based off of my previous programming around interacting with the outdoors on a physical level, well, getting those substances off board actually gave me the capacity to strengthen my body to a very significant level, and then achieve some of the greatest accomplishments of my life, or of my career for that matter, in the outdoors. And so there were, like I said, initially there were a lot of benefits that came with that. So the new challenges that arose for me, it was like 4.5, almost 5 years. I was 5 years into the process. I'd quit drinking for 5 years. I'd not done cocaine for 4, and my physical health started to wane. It was interesting. I went from the absolute peak performance of my life, and then within a few months, I became very, very sick. And I started to have this underlying problem. And it's interesting because that underlying condition existed previously. And quitting drinking and getting the substance off board and starting to work on my health and focus on my diet, those things were seemingly helpful. But this physical thing started to manifest itself in terms of a bone infection that ultimately was trying to kill me. And so I went from physical ease to complete physical unrest. And then slowly I started to understand that there was more mental, emotional baggage to dig up. That I needed to take a deeper look at myself and really try to understand how it is that I was making myself sick. For many years, like after I quit drinking, for the previous 5 years, I had been coming to Central America and spending part of the year here to live. And The challenges with my health became quite great, to the point where it was affecting my work and it was affecting my social life. It was affecting every part of my life. I had been getting good health care in Central America and been working with practitioners that had been able to help me find a new way. And I had gotten very sick in the United States, and then as I was reaching out for more health care, looking for more support in this physical realm, I started to get sicker and sicker. And so ultimately I made a decision where I thought I was dying. And I remember a doctor that I was working with at the time said to me, I said, "I'm leaving and I'm moving out of the country." And he said, "You need more help." I said, "I know." And he said, "If you don't get the right help, this may kill you." And I said, "Yes, but I think if I stay here, it's going to kill me faster." And so I basically uprooted, left everything, and decided to put myself in an environment where it was easier on my body, to get out of working in a high elevation, cold winter environment, and move to a place that was softer and easier on my body, to give myself some rest and to work with the practitioners that I had been finding the most help from. It's interesting because I got even sicker when I first got here, but then I slowly got better. And I started to notice a trend where every time I would go back to the United States, once I would come back, even for a short period of time, once I would come back to Central America, I would slowly decline. I would get sick again, and then it would take me a little while to get back on my feet until finally I ultimately ended up having yet another surgery. It was the 5th surgery, and interestingly enough, it seems like we finally got to the underlying cause of it, at least on the physical level. And what I realized along the way on the emotional level is that I had substituted substance for a physical accomplishment in the field. And I was also trying to grow my business and stake a new claim. And so there I was, trying to prove myself again. And so what I found when I moved to Central America was, one, not just good practitioners to help me, but time to reflect on what it was that I was doing. And then ultimately realize that I needed to do things for me, for the sake of things that I wanted to do, and I needed to quit trying to prove to everybody that I had value. I needed to prove that to myself. I needed to accept that. What's next is, one, I'm back on my feet again from a health perspective. And I still have some challenges associated with that, but I'm in a functioning spot, and I continue to keep getting stronger and healthier. And my drive to serve has not changed. The difference this time is that I want to serve myself while I am serving others. And so we're opening up a nonprofit, creating a foundation. That foundation is to conserve a piece of land and ultimately create a sustainable approach to life in a community on that piece of land. And then what we would like to do through the foundation is provide education and opportunities for individuals to do work stays where they can interact with the natural environment and also learn the process of sustainability. And then we also want to give individuals who are struggling with things like depression, PTSD, anxiety, an opportunity to do a work stay as well, and provide them something that was a big challenge for me, which was the time and the space and a relief from the financial liabilities of the day-to-day, to help them integrate back into this ecosystem, this world, this interaction of the natural world that we live in and how much it provides, and give people a space to recognize what they're part of, while also providing them access to mental health support in order to be able to provide them a new way. And like I said, I think the biggest thing that I'm trying to do is remove that financial burden, because when I started this path, everybody wanted me to get back to work. And I knew deep down that I also wanted to get back to work, but the way I was going about my work, and if I was to go back to it, I would probably go crazy. And so for me, I resisted medication because I knew the medication would get me back to work, but I probably wouldn't work through the problems that I had. And so I took the long route, and I had to make some significant sacrifices financially in my life in order to be able to make that space. And so that's really what we want to do, is we want to help people connect back and really give them a new, fresh start into doing things the way they want to do, not how it was impressed upon them or conditioned to them because of their previous environment. The advice I would have given to myself 8 years ago, I think I did give this advice to myself, which was be patient. Process takes time. We live in this world today of instant gratification. Everything gets solved. And when we store up emotional baggage, it often takes a good bit of time in order to work through those issues. And so being patient with yourself, and then also working on the judgment factor, because the more you judge yourself, the more difficult it is to get through your process. And that's why it's so important to surround yourself with people that understand that there's no rush, that everything will unfold the way it's supposed to, and there's also no end. Because you may work through the emotions of the past, but it's important to realize that those situations keep coming at you, and you're going to have to work within those emotions and take the time to process through them. So it's really a new way of being, and letting go of the old life is the key. The attachment that we have to the things that we used to do is exactly what holds us back from creating something new. It holds us back from being the things that we feel we are. I always felt like this was something that I could do. And so it's interesting for me to come back to feelings that I was having as a teenager, before any of this even started. And it brings me back to the things that I want in life. And so I said this to a friend of mine, and I said, I wish I would have had the courage to make this decision at the age of 25. And they said to me, do you know how old I am? And I said, no, and they started laughing. They said, I'm 25, and they said, you don't know how impactful that statement is right now, because I'm terrified to do the thing that I want to do. And I'm almost getting ready to make the safe choice. And I said, the safe choice is not what you want in life, is it? And she said, no, there's these other things that I want. And I said, well, you can take the risk now, or you can go through life and hope to build up the courage to take the risk later. The risk, or the unknown, is where the adventure of life begins. The choice is yours.